Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Murphy, Tour Program Supervisor. Thanks for joining me again for another 15-minute tour and discussion on prison medical care. Today, we're focusing on the history of surgery at Eastern State Penitentiary. Feel free to make comments and ask questions as we go along. Now, by the early 20th century, Eastern State had transformed Cell Block 3 into a modern hospital facility. And one of the most impressive features was an operating room installed in 1910. This photo is from 1912, just a little bit later. The prison's physician, Dr. Hassel, made the following comments once it was finished. Quote, "The new operating room finished this year is complete and up to date, a credit to the penitentiary and the advanced humanitarian ideas of the gentleman who authorized it. Previous to its completion, operations had to be performed in a cell, extemporized into an operating room, where good results were almost as much a matter of luck as the result of scientific care and surgical cleanliness." Yikes, did you catch that last part? An extemporized cell. Less than ideal for surgery. Recently, another tour guide and I were talking about pictures of scenes in Eastern State's history that we wish we had in our collection. And I said that I wish that there was a picture of a cell set up for an operation. It's probably a pretty gruesome scene. Now, we don't have a lot of information about surgeries at Eastern State in the 19th century, but there are some interesting examples here and there. In 1842, the famous English author Charles Dickens visited Eastern State and interviewed some prisoners. He left with a pretty negative impression of the institution and would end up writing a scathing 11-page report of the prison's notorious system of solitary confinement, the Pennsylvania system. But during his visit, he also met a man who had surgery at Eastern State. Dickens writes, quote, "Some 2 or 3 had prisoner nurses with them, for they were very sick, and one, a fat old Negro, whose leg had been taken off within the jail, had for his attendant a classical scholar and an accomplished surgeon, himself a prisoner likewise," end quote. Now, although Dickens doesn't name this person, it was almost certainly a prisoner named James Reynolds. The warden recorded an amputation surgery in his journal on October 26, 1841, just a few months before Dickens' visit. It seems Reynolds had had his leg amputated below the knee. He finished his sentence August 24th, 1842, and was discharged, quote, "in good health." This is the notes for his discharge. You see his name at the top and the fact that his leg had been amputated at the bottom. Now, there's a lot going on in this little snippet for an Eastern State historian. We have an exception to the prison's rule of solitary confinement for medical purposes. We also have an example of a surgery in the early years, of course, but we also see another prisoner, a former doctor, using his skills to help another prisoner inside the walls. Prisoners would work as nurses, attendants, technicians, and orderlies throughout the history of Eastern State. The men in the background of this photo, assisting with surgery, are believed to be prisoners. Today, it'd be pretty rare to see prisoners being employed in skilled medical jobs. Most work performed in modern prison hospitals by the incarcerated is usually janitorial or custodial in nature. There are some interesting exceptions, though. In the Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola, where most prisoners are serving a life sentence and are expected to die in the prison, officials have added a cutting-edge hospice care facility that is staffed by the incarcerated, volunteers, and medical professionals. The story of the hospice is told in the documentary, Opening the Door, Angola Prison Hospice. Maybe that should be our next Netflix watch party. What do you folks think? What should end-of-life care look like inside of prisons? Let us know in the comments section below. Just checking questions from the chat. A 1958 article in a prisoner-published newspaper, the Eastern Echo, claims that there were nearly 300 operations performed in the space every year. And doctors performed a wide variety of procedures, from simple tonsillectomies to optical surgery and even plastic surgery. Here we have Matilda Carter, inmate B3300. She had her eye removed by the Eastern State physician on April 28th, 1907, and it shows up in this, there's evidence of something going on with her eye in this picture here. And it seems that the medical facilities were good enough for Eastern State's most famous prisoner, Al Capone. Capone had his tonsils taken out on September 5th, 1929 by Dr. Herbert Goddard, physician at Eastern State and the vice president of the prison's board of trustees. We're not sure, but there's also evidence to suggest that Capone had an adult circumcision in the prison. In the late 1800s through the 1920s, circumcision was being evaluated by the medical community as a possible treatment and/or prevention of sexually transmitted diseases. Capone himself suffered from syphilis and gonorrhea for most of his life, ultimately dying from advanced neurosyphilis in 1947. In 1955, a prisoner named Albert Lipinski had a series of 8 facial reconstructive surgeries. The newspaper article on the left covering Lipinski's story claims that his surgeries were paid for by a, quote, prisoner's welfare fund built up by contributions from prisoners, used to assist families of prisoners, and sometimes in worthwhile cases, a prisoner himself. Lipinski describes himself as, quote, disfigured, and was apparently missing one ear. But again, we see an example of men incarcerated at Eastern State taking care of each other. It's also an example of elective surgery. What other kinds of elective procedures might be carried out in prisons today? Let us know what you think in the comments. Now, going back a little bit, plastic surgery wasn't always elective. The article on the right tells the story of a prisoner named Felix Boni, who was convicted of killing his wife with a shotgun. Now, he also turned the weapon on himself in a suicide attempt. He miraculously survived the attempt, but completely destroyed his jaw in the process, making it impossible for him to eat or speak. And Eastern State doctors attempted to correct the problem with surgery, but it seems that he died on the table while under anesthetic. Unfortunately, sometimes surgeries didn't always go as planned. And Felix was not the only prisoner to die in the operating room. Here we see a table of deaths from 1939 to 1940. On April 17th, 1940, Warden Herbert Smith wrote in his journal, quote, died at 9:40 a.m. under anesthesia on operating table C9498, Nathaniel Barnwell. 2 deputy coroners visited the prison to investigate the death, and his body was removed to the 8th District Police for a coroner's investigation. We don't know what type of procedure Barnwell was undergoing. He had arrived at Eastern State in 1934 with a life sentence for murder. Prisons can be violent places, and Eastern State was no exception. When someone was seriously injured in a fight, they sometimes ended up in the operating room for emergency care. At least one person, Frank Sayers, pictured here, died in the operating room after being stabbed. On May 31st, 1922, Warden Robert McKenty noted that, quote, C601 was stabbed in a fight in the yard at 11 a.m. He was taken to the operating room and died at 12:05 p.m. Prison officials sometimes also made difficult choices when devoting surgical resources. In January of 1895, prisoner John Jackson was denied surgery for cancer of the tongue because he was getting out next month. It seems like Dr. Ball and Mr. Vo, who are both mentioned in the snippet from the Warden's Daily Journal, felt like it wasn't their problem to solve. This is we don't have a picture of prisoner Jackson, but we do have a picture of Vo, who was a prominent Philadelphian. We don't know much about the closure of the hospital or the operating room. We assume that it was used till the building's closure in the 1970s. Today, there's little medical equipment left behind. Usable equipment might have been sent to other prisons or state agencies that could use them. They may have also been looted during the prison's 20+ years of abandonment. The operating room light has hung on, though, and still fascinates visitors to this day. Visitors can take in-person tours of the hospital when we're open with an expert guide. Today, the states have a constitutional mandate to provide people in prisons with necessary health care, but surgery is rarely done inside of prisons anymore. Prisons typically provide on-site primary care and some basic outpatient services. Departments of Corrections also usually arrange for some prisons within their system to house specialized clinics or units for treatments like dialysis or chemotherapy. But surgery for a prisoner is usually done in an off-site hospital. Transporting and guarding prisoners and training medical staff to work in secure wings results in huge costs for departments of corrections. According to a 2018 Pew Charitable Trust study, off-site care can amount to over 20% of a Department of Corrections healthcare costs. Some prisons, systems like North Carolina, Texas, and Georgia, have built their own prison hospitals to consolidate inpatient hospitalizations. People over 55 are one of the fastest growing demographics inside the US prison population. And these folks are more likely to need surgery because they're more likely to have health conditions like heart disease, cancer, or diabetes. As a result, healthcare costs continue to grow for prison systems across the US, forcing policymakers and corrections officials to search for low-cost solutions and alternatives. And this sometimes results in the quality of care being pushed down. Some criminal justice reform advocates believe that the state of healthcare in the prison system is so poor that it sometimes constitutes a violation of the Eighth Amendment, which protects us from cruel and unusual punishment. Now, access to healthcare is a thorny issue in the United States in general, and even more so when we're talking about healthcare for people inside of prisons. So, some questions for consideration. Does lack of access to quality healthcare amount to cruel and unusual punishment? What should healthcare look like inside the walls of prisons? Is access to quality healthcare a human right? Let's hear your opinions in the comments section. I'm going to stop the show. And hopefully I can take some questions and read off some comments. Okay. What was the most skill and time-intensive surgery done at Eastern State? That's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer for time intensive, but we do have evidence of sophisticated plastic surgery and some cardiac surgery. I do know of one instance of a prisoner who had to be sent out of the building because he had a condition where an operation that had to remove something. I forget, it was either a vein or a tumor from his spinal cord, and they felt like they couldn't handle it inside the OR. What measures were in place to help prisoners recover from surgery? Eastern State did have a large recovery ward just a few feet from the entrance to the operating room, and prisoners would spend some time in this more comfortable medical setting before transitioning back to their cells. And we have another question. How many prisoners were incarcerated at Eastern State in any given year? This answer varies greatly over time. The prison was originally meant to hold about 450 people, but by 1931, it would hold as many as 1,800 prisoners. So a pretty big gulf there. With 1,800 people in the building, that would have been extreme overcrowding, and the prison officials at that time were doing whatever they could to get people to other buildings, other prisons. Here we have a comment. I think preserving dignity for people dying in prison is so essential. I would love a larger conversation about hospice care. Thank you for your comment. I would love that too. Maybe we should think about highlighting that in a future hospital program. It's a really, I would recommend watching the documentary. It's really powerful stuff. Did Al Capone ever go to the infirmary? Yeah, so he was there for a tonsillectomy, and we know that he had another procedure, which I think I mentioned. We have evidence to suggest that he was he had an adult circumcision as a treatment for sexually transmitted diseases. We don't think, the medical field does not believe that to be an effective treatment anymore, so that doesn't happen anymore. There's a newspaper article actually that notes that the journalist claims he saw Al Capone in the recovery ward reading a biography of Napoleon Bonaparte, which is kind of interesting to think about. Give another minute for some other questions or comments to come through. Okay. Well, it looks like that's it. I want to thank everyone for their questions and their comments. We'll have another hospital tour next Wednesday. In the meantime, if you want to stay connected, there's lots of ways. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our website, easternstate.org. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope to see you next Wednesday at 2:30. Have a good one. Bye.